Good afternoon, welcome to MEED Live. My name is Richard Thompson, I'm the Editorial Director of MEED. This week's broadcast we're going to look at Saudi Arabia in particular. It is the biggest market in the region and it is the market that has gone through the most astonishing process of change over the past 2 years, whether it is from the accession of the new king, King Salman, 2 years ago, through to the Vision 2030 economic reform programme and the National Transformation Programme. So it's a huge market, a hugely important market, and also one with the greatest number of question marks about what's going on in the business environment. So we're going to look at that today. If you want to take part in the discussion, please, as normal, send in your questions using the field in front of you, on the screen in front of you. Also send in your opinions and your thoughts about the Saudi market. And then if you have further questions about the wider Middle East or GCC environment, we can get onto that as well. So get involved in today's conversation. I'm joined today by three MEED experts who have all just returned from Saudi Arabia. So we're going to have quite a wide-ranging discussion with a lot of information available for you to tap into. So if I could just start with you, Ed James, Director of Analysis and Content at MEED Projects. You have just published this report, the GCC Projects Market Forecast and Outlook. So that covers the whole of the GCC and, of course, Saudi Arabia. And you were in Saudi yesterday, you've just come back. What's your feeling about the mood in Saudi Arabia? How, in terms of the projects market particularly, what are people still very, very unclear about where business is coming from in the future?
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it's very much an uncertain picture right now. People are unclear exactly what is going to happen, how it's going to pan out, and how long the changes you've spoken about will take place. And from a facts on the ground perspective, purely from a projects market perspective, very unfortunately, we've not seen an acceleration in project activity this year.
But last year, your data showed something like, I think it was a 60% fall in the
Correct,
Saudi
yes.
projects market year on year, so 2016 compared to 2015. Huge collapse in the projects market. What does your data show this year? We're only 3/4 of the way through 2017, but what does the data show?
And of course, that collapse in activity was not restricted to Saudi Arabia alone, which makes the situation so difficult for everyone in the projects market in the region. This year, unfortunately, we haven't seen a radical improvement. There has been a slight uptick in awards during July and August, which does offer some glimmer of hope for the rest of the year and moving to 2018. But for the supply chain in the projects market, unfortunately, there hasn't been an improvement.
But there has been, I think, from the report, at least with Aramco, there has been some better signs of life in the projects market.
Right. Yeah. So actually, in terms of oil sector spending and power sector spending, there has been already a greater number of contract awards than last year. So that's promising. But for transport and construction and the gas sector, there's been a lot less. Okay. So at best, Saudi Arabia will match last year's number of about $25 billion, okay. And the region as a whole will match last year's number, but of course that is way, way down on 2014, 2015 levels. The silver lining, or the good news, if there is some, is that behind the scenes a lot of changes are being made. And the hope can be that while this year has been disappointing from a project's contract awards perspective, the changes are being made to set in motion a greater range of project awards next year.
Let's come on to that,
which we'll come on to
in more detail in the show. So thanks for that, Ed. Also with us next to Ed is Andrew Roscoe, MEED's Power and Water Editor. Now in Saudi Arabia, obviously a huge power development program over many years through the Saudi Electricity Company has driven IWPPs and IPPs. Now we're moving into this privatization phase and it's all change in the electricity sector, and we're also seeing this move into renewables. So Andrew, what is your feeling, just before we get into the detail of projects and clients? The power sector, Ed just mentioned that that's one of the areas where there are still things happening, in terms of projects. What's your feeling? What's the mood? Are people excited about the privatization? Are they excited about renewables, or is it all too uncertain?
Well, I think to start with, Okay, there is a past record in IPPs and IWPPs, but in the last few years they've moved back towards the EPC model since about 2010, and it's just now, with oil prices having dropped, the Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan, they're moving back towards IPP and IWPP model. So because of that, there's actually been, in terms of mega power projects, generation projects, a slowdown. So as Ed mentioned, there might be an uptick in awards. That's due to a lot of transmission distribution projects. And also, for example, Yanbu 3, there's a contract awarded this year. That had actually been awarded previously.
Right.
And then the contract with Samsung was cancelled. So that was re-tendered.
So if we just look in terms of contract awards, it's a little bit distorted because of the sort of phasing of things.
There has been a slowdown in terms of the mega power projects planned. But as Ed said, there's movement and there's stuff happening. It just hasn't really converted into awards or tenders for big projects yet. I would say the renewable sector is the one part which has been positive. So they created the new REPDO office earlier this year, Renewable Energy Project Development Office, which is under the Ministry of Energy. So that sits under Al Fala, his stewardship. So that's making progress. It's issued tenders for the first 2 projects, 700 megawatts in total. So that's doing well. And I think that the market's waiting to see about the conventional plants.
Yeah.
Apparently the utilities met recently with the Finance Ministry, and they were looking at which projects will go ahead. And the message
what's your sense with, I think with renewables we have this new organisation, we have the National Renewable Energy Programme, so you can kind of put that over here and say that's the renewables programme, but within the conventional sector, the Saudi electricity company sector, there's this whole question mark about privatisation and unbundling of the utility into generation companies and transmission companies. Has that created any fears, about a hiatus in spending or decision making or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's had a little effect. They've got a lot to organise. But I think the thing was with the big projects, one, the demand wasn't very urgent because there's quite a lot of extra capacity commissioned last year. And secondly, it's the strive for privatisation that's being led. So the projects now will all go as IPPs or IWPPs. So it takes a while to get this model finalised and moving ahead with that. And I think it was just in terms of meeting to discuss which projects are necessary.
Okay.
And you mentioned the privatisation. That's already being sort of looked at and dealt with in the tenders. So, for example, the REPDO renewable tenders, the difference there is that the developer will own 100% of the project company.
Okay.
Whereas previously the utility had kept about 40% stake, 40-50% stake. And also earlier this year, they finalised the creation of the principal buyer, and that will play a key part of the privatisation process, which will offtake the electricity and buy and supply the fuel to the developers. So.
Okay, I want to come back to you on all of these areas later on in the show. Also joining us today is Jennifer Aguinaldo. Jenny is MEED's Transport and Technology Editor. Now, the transport sector, I think, is, for me, one of the most interesting in Saudi Arabia. We have, 2 years ago, rail was the story. We had the Riyadh Metro, we had the Haramain High-Speed Railway, we had the plan for Mecca Metro, and with the fall in oil prices and the fiscal consolidation programme, all of it went on hold. But this year, we've seen the airports have been driving the privatisation activity, and now you've been writing on MEED about the railway privatisations. Things are really happening in transport.
Thank you, Richard. It's probably, ironically, it's for the aviation sector in particular, it's probably one of the busiest years so far, because in 2016 they started their privatization project way before the NTP was formulated, right? So there's a working template.
The NTP is the National Transformation Programme.
Exactly. So in 2016 there were no major contract awards in the airport, in the aviation sector, basically because they were looking and reviewing at their public capital spending. And when 2017 rolled around, there have been a lot of awards. Started with the award of the Yanbu Airport. These are 4 airport projects that have been awarded using the PPP model in the first 2 quarters of the year.
So, I mean, the thing that I think is astonishing, so Saudi Arabia has 27 airports.
Yes, that's right.
GACA, the General Authority for Civil Aviation, they said they wanted to privatise all of them by 2020. And then last month, they said they're going to do it all this year.
Yes, exactly.
Is that realistic?
Well, I think it depends on what, we don't really exactly know what they mean by privatization. It is clear that they are pursuing at least three options, three methods to get there, one being a formation of an airport company for some of the largest companies, and then offering a certain stake of these airports to the public or to private investors. And the other one would be signing long-term O&Ms like they did with Jeddah Airport, where Changi Airports International has been assigned as the O&M. And then, of course, the third path would be using PPP. And obviously, not all airports, especially the domestic and regional airports, are probably ripe for a PPP model. So
why would some be ripe for PPP and some not?
Well, the 4 airports that they've awarded on a PPP basis, some of these are regional, like Hail that caters to the northern traffic, where they really need an airport where there's enough traffic there, and there's probably a good business case to build a PPP. And then Taif will be an international airport, which will be the third airport to cater to Mecca. And the others are regional or domestic airports. So these, and also they are the most, probably the busiest airports, regional airports, apart, in addition to the 3 international airports today. So definitely, if you have traffic, then there's fees from passengers, there's baggage handling fees, and then aircraft traffic probably.
So it comes down to the commercial model.
Exactly.
For an airport or anything to be offered up as a full PPP, it has to have that commercial model, and some of those smaller airports are just not ready.
That's what we think. And in terms of railways, it was there wasn't any major project award this year, but there has been a lot of movement in terms of regulation. So we saw SRO and SAR being merged, their operations being merged, and PTA being officially acting as the regulator of the sector, and PTA is the client for the privatization of the mainline railway sector as well.
The privatization process, that from what you've been writing on MEED.com, they've broadly, there's no official structure or timeline, but they've broadly split it into 2 elements, the infrastructure and the operations side. Is that correct?
There's infrastructure, there's operations, and then you have the systems and rolling stock as well, because these different areas of the railway sector, they carry different risks and require different levels of investment, basically. So I think they're approaching as many interested parts as possible who will participate in
and then, of course, there is this problem that there's no precedent for it. There's no framework or legal structures for privatization in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, definitely. So that's again, I think that's one of the reasons why they are doing this annual review, or maybe resetting some of the objectives or KPIs set, because the main issue would be the soft infrastructure, regulations, and human capital, right? So you want to do this as fast as you can, but it's now you have the reconning, right? So do we have enough infrastructure, and do we have enough regulations to let this happen?
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that, Jen. So we've just had a brief introduction from Ed, Andrew and Jenny looking at transport, power and the projects market. You can get involved in this conversation, sending in your questions, which will come on appear on my laptop, and I can field them to the team. So please feel free to get involved and to ask questions or to make observations. Probably we should have a quick overview of the context of the business environment in Saudi Arabia. The IMF, in its most recent report, its Article 4 consultation with Saudi Arabia, which was published in July, they downgraded the Saudi outlook for GDP growth for 2017 to almost zero. It's 0.1% growth they've projected for this year, and for next year an improvement in growth, but only to 1.1% annual growth. So those are very slow rates of economic growth, and that reflects the fall in oil prices, obviously, over the past 2 or 3 years since 2014, but also the OPEC oil production cuts, which Saudi Arabia has had to go from producing 10.5 million barrels a day to less than 10 million barrels of oil a day. So all of that affects Saudi revenues, and then the fiscal consolidation program by the Ministry of Finance that stops government spending, and that has restricted non-oil growth, the construction sector, for example, to about 1.7%. So a big sort of block this year for Saudi growth, and that's the context we're in. We have also seen, and you can read this on MEED.com, in the past week, a review of the National Transformation Programme. So this programme to transform the Saudi economy, to privatise and to diversify. It was launched last year in June by the Crown Prince, or then Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, around 370 different targets and objectives with 546 different initiatives. This year it's become apparent it's too much, and as Jenny has just said, there's the soft infrastructure as well as the hard infrastructure side. So the transformation programme itself is now under review, and we shall hear more about that over the next few weeks and months. So that's the context. Saudi is trying to go through this transformation. They're trying to cut back on government being the driver of economic growth and get to the privatisation side, and in the meantime everything's been on hold. Ed, if we can now come back to the wider projects market. So what you have said is we're not going to see a big pickup year on year from last year, but you have said there have been some areas of optimism, so perhaps we can look at those areas first. If you could perhaps go through the Saudi market by sector, maybe look at oil and gas and then power and construction. Who is going to be driving investment in those sectors, and what are the sort of the key flagship projects?
Sure. So I suppose as we spoke about earlier, the three most active sectors this year, and the ones which have shown the biggest signs of improvement year on year, oil, which is primarily driven by, as you would expect, investments by Saudi Aramco. Obviously, the continual drive to try and produce additional amounts of gas for power generation purposes, for petrochemical development, and also eventually potentially for heavy industry. We've also seen a pickup in power sector awards, as Andy touched on earlier. We're moving now to, again, back to the IPP or IWPP model, and we have seen both in the transmission and distribution side and in the generation side, greater amount of activity than the whole of last year already, and we're talking beginning of September here, so with 3 months to go, we're going to by far and away exceed last year's number. These are two growth areas year on year anyway. And then the other area of growth we've seen is really on the airport side. Now, airports, or in aviation in general, is one of those protected or insulated sectors alongside education, healthcare, social housing, and defence. And as Jenny has already elaborated, we've seen tendering of a number of major airport developments, the award of a number of developments.
When you say protected sector, what you mean here is that this is strategically critical, and so with the fiscal consolidation or cutbacks,
yes,
these ones...
The sectors least likely to be affected by cuts in government expenditure, because they are considered essential to the cohesive national fabric of the nation.
And you said airports is... The airport sector is doing well, and Jenny's touched on the privatisation process of airports. Are you saying that there has actually been investment into construction projects, or is it just the award of concessions that...
Well, there's the award of the concessions, but there's also been some construction deals for projects which aren't deemed suitable for PPP. For example, just 2 weeks ago, GACA issued a tender for 12 new regional expansion of 12 regional airports.
So you've written about that's about upgrading some. You talked about the commercial case. That's about making these smaller airports more attractive to private investors. Is that right?
You can say that would be the long-term goal. Would be to make these airports have better services, better facilities, so that eventually, if the plan is to privatize all of them, is to probably offer parts of them, some stake to private investors if there are any that are interested. But then again, it's not just airports, but the infrastructure around the airports as well.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these small domestic airports, I think the road networks, among others, still have to be addressed, which should be part of building a better connectivity
So
around
who's responsible? So you have GACA is responsible for the airport. So you have this, bit of concrete with a terminal and a runway, and then coming up to it, presumably that is either central government or a municipal authority.
No, with the new model now, GACA will become a pure play regulator. So previously it owns and operates all the airports as well. So right now all these airports and other assets are being transferred to an entity called Saudi Civil Aviation Holding Company, and all these airport assets will eventually be transferred to the PIF.
Okay.
So
the PIF is the Public Investment Fund, and it's the big sovereign fund that is redistributing the privatization.
And there have been some changes because prior to the NTP, GACA said they will be offering at least 75% of some of the airports to private investors. But it now appears that they will only be offering minority stake, and you can see that PIF will be the main stakeholder for many of these airports eventually.
So PIF, I think, is an interesting organisation that we're going to hear a lot more about. Certainly they're part of the, they're going to be the main beneficiary of the Aramco IPO, so that's $100 billion hopefully coming into their funds. Sorry, Ed, if we can come back to, so we were talking about some of the growth sectors there. On the oil and gas side, this year to date, Aramco is the main driver of project spending. Is that upstream or downstream, or is it possible to sort of look at where the strategic direction of Aramco spending is going?
Yeah, I mean it's a mix of both upstream and downstream, as midstream as well in terms of pipelines as well. We've got just last week, for example, we heard of EOI has been issued for a new sour gas plant. For example, sour gas now being across the region a pivot of increasing importance as easily accessible gas reserves are becoming rarer to find. We've also seen increasing amounts of work offshore, the Offshore Maintained Potential Programme, again, as easier onshore plays, diminishing. So, like all the other NOCs in the region, Aramco is having to exploit previously considered more difficult oil plays, and that includes offshore, that includes EOR, includes tight gas, sour gas, and so on.
Most of this procurement for sort of the maintaining potential, which is about aging reservoirs and keeping, maintaining output from those fields. Will that come through the long-term agreement? So we've seen over the past couple of years this ramp up in Aramco spending for their long-term supply chain contractors, and they have five pre-qualified long-term agreements. And there has been talk about increasing the number of long-term suppliers, and that changes the procurement model a little bit, doesn't it? Do you think a lot of this potential maintenance, field potential maintenance program will come through those long-term agreements?
And it's not just Aramco. The whole procurement system in general in Saudi Arabia is going to have to go through an overhaul, and maybe even, I'm not sure this is the right word, a sort of modernization process, because as we saw the authorities mentioned earlier this year, they reckon a third of all historic capital spending over the last decade could have been saved if they had applied more efficient procurement processes.
Well, so Aramco is planning to spend, $334 billion over the next 10 years. So if they can save a third of that, that's $3.5 billion.
Yes, and of course, I mean, Aramco has always been at the forefront of the most efficient procurement processes. But nonetheless, every department, every ministry will be told they have to be accountable for their budgets and their procurement, and to make sure they're getting best value for money. And that means changing your procurement processes, changing your tendering procedures, then so be it. And with Aramco, I wouldn't be surprised to see greater pre-qualification of companies, greater scrutiny of companies' capabilities, especially among local contractors and their workloads. And it's not just the clients who have to change, but the projects market and projects community too. Contractors are having to rapidly evolve, subcontractors, consultants.
So I have a question. We've received a number of questions already. Thank you very much for those, and we'll introduce them as the conversation goes. But keep the questions coming, because we have just over half an hour to go, and it's a great opportunity to try and answer your questions, but also for us to get a sense of what information that you are interested in. So Ed, on this point about Aramco, we have a question here, which is that given that the Aramco IPO will now be delayed, is likely to be delayed until Q1 2019. So I don't know if that bit of information is actually accurate or confirmed, but how likely are we to see significant contract awards in 2018? So I guess the broader question is, how relevant is the IPO to the project's spending programme?
Well, Aramco, and indeed most NOCs, do operate on a longer term horizon than a lot of clients. Aramco, when it's planning its projects, is looking 5 years ahead, because it takes that long, or that amount of time on average for new projects to come on stream. And generally speaking, NOCs don't react as greatly or as much to oil price changes as other sectors. My personal opinion, and again, this is depending on whether the IPO is delayed to 2019 or not, I don't expect Aramco to slow down or halt its.
They've been pretty clear actually, and they've got
slew
this
of
10-year
contract awards.
This
Yeah.
10-year program, which is upstream down. It's mostly upstream, but drilling or production
Yeah,
capacity,
sure.
and it's 334 or thereabouts
Yes.
$1 billion over 10 years. The CEO has said that in public.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, delaying contracts or projects might be counterintuitive. When Aramco goes to market and its prospectus, it's got to show, other than the fact that the obvious attraction is that it has 60, 70 years of oil production left, which it has monopoly control to produce. It's also got to show that it can maintain output at certain levels. At the moment, its production capacity in the kingdom is 12.5 million barrels a day. And if it doesn't award contracts, then it puts that threat, that number. So by awarding projects and proceeding with them, Aramco is showing the world and the potential future investors that it is sticking to that target and is able to meet it.
We've actually got on MEED.com, Will Crisp, our oil analyst, has done a piece of work looking at Aramco or Saudi oil and gas spending in the past year, and it shows that actually Aramco spending is at the highest level, or activity is at the highest level it's been for 5 years.
Yes.
The reason is unclear, but one reason might be that the costs, as you say, are the sort of, this is the time to spend and position yourself for the long term.
Well, the global economy is performing okay, but not great. That means there's obviously been a commodity price fall in certain key materials such as steel and copper and rebar and so forth. So for a lot of NOCs, which have very big, expensive EPC contracts to award and have large procurement items, requirements, it does make sense, as we saw in 2009 when the EPC prices fell. NOCs went ahead and proceeded with their awards. But most importantly, we do have a long-term investment focus for these types of company, and they're not going to be swayed by short-term trends and issues such as oil price. They have no choice. They have to keep proceeding and awarding contracts.
In your projections for Saudi, if you can remember off the top of your head, so what is your current projection for the total value of project contract awards in Saudi Arabia for this year? Is it about 51, I think?
Well, so 2014 and 15 we're hitting very good and by far away the largest in the region contract awards of about $52 billion.
Okay.
Last year, as government spending stopped, this fell quite dramatically to $25 billion.
This is Saudi Arabia we're talking
so
about.
more than 50% fall.
Okay.
This year, as of end of August, we were on $17 billion. So with 4 months to go, we are on a pro rata basis, most likely looking at $25 billion again.
Okay, so for 2017 across all sectors in Saudi, something like $25 billion, which would still be historically very low, but a slight improvement on last year. And but Aramco is accounting for the bulk of this.
That's right. Yeah.
And Aramco have said they're going to spend 30 billion plus, which isn't just project spending, it's obviously across other areas. So what I think you're saying and what I'm trying to get at is that the core driver for Saudi projects this year at least, and probably next year, is going to be Aramco's oil and gas program.
Yes, indeed. In fact, actually, if you look at the top 20 contracts awarded last year in Saudi Arabia, more than 15 of them were by Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco was the main driver of most project activity last year. Indeed, without it, the kingdom would have fared a lot worse.
So
than it actually
we have
did.
a question here from a banker operating in the region who says, what are your thoughts on oil and gas projects over the next 1 to 2 years? So this is why I was asking.
Yeah,
and I think this is focused on Saudi because it says, will the encouragement of more foreign firms, potentially without the need for long-term agreements, make a difference to the process and pricing? So I guess it's, again, next 1 or 2 years, Saudi oil and gas.
Yeah, and obviously you have more competition. You have potentially lower prices as contractors try to be more competitive. The long-term prognosis for oil and gas is still very strong. I mean, you have various different drivers. Clearly, the need for additional gas production is paramount to keep up with new power production capacity. Gas can also be used for petrochemicals and for heavy industry to create jobs being very critical area for most economies in the region, and also because you can diversify your economy going down the value chain in the heavy metals and petrochemical industries. At the same time, you've got to maintain oil output, and some of these oil fields in the region have been producing now for 50, 60 plus years.
Yeah.
And regardless of how large they are reaching a point where new enhanced production techniques are required. And so we are seeing EOR being introduced increasingly throughout the region. Likewise with gas, easily available gas is in short supply, and companies have to spend more to tap into those increasingly difficult sour and tight gas plays.
I'm going to give one more question to
Sure,
you before
of course.
I move on to Andrew and Jenny, and you can have a breather. But we have heard a lot of noise from Saudi about going for unconventional oil over the past few years. But recently we've had a report, again from Will Crisp on MEED.com, that Aramco possibly scaling back its focus on shale oil and unconventional to focus on the development of conventional oil production. Is that your reading of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's Aramco is a very Aramco, unlike in certain sectors, it's very difficult to know what Aramco's long-term vision is in terms of how it translates into specific projects, because Aramco, and this may well change with the IPO and prospectus, they may have to become a bit more open about what their long-term investment plans are and where they plan to be precisely, along with the more precise the numbering of oil reserves and oil fields and so forth. So Aramco has awarded a couple of big deals in the shale gas side. It is proceeding with a sour gas project right now as well. Harad field as well is focused on gas. My feeling is that Aramco will combine the two, oil and gas, will keep moving on both areas. Interestingly, if we look at the gas sector, the oil sector has outperformed last year's numbers, but the gas sector is way down. So at least in terms of the last 12 months, we've seen a much lower investment in the gas side. But at the same time, we're also talking about a sample size of quite a small number of projects. So it's often difficult to read into trends too much in this area. But expect Aramco to increasingly go offshore, expect Aramco to go increasingly to more difficult oil and gas plays, and expect Aramco to have to invest greater amounts than ever before in EOR, because that's just the nature of the oil and gas sector in the kingdom. Fields are aging.
There's going to be a lot of pressure just domestically on Aramco to keep some spending going, because you can't have nothing. So there's this Aramco's objectives, and then there's the national
and the capex and opex of maintaining output at 12.5 million barrels a day are absolutely enormous. And the logistics and the deliveries and the treatment of additional oil and gas production is enormous again. So whatever happens to the oil price, whatever happens to the economic situation in the kingdom, Aramco is always going to be a major, if not the major spender in the kingdom.
Okay, thank you. Catch your breath for a few minutes. You've had a lot of demand on your knowledge there. If I can move to you, Andrew. We touched earlier on about the Saudi electricity company privatization, the unbundling. So we have a question here from a technology company in the energy sector. With the possible delays of the overall unbundling of SEC, says the questioner, now being pushed back to the first quarter of 2018 as opposed to the last quarter of 2017. So again, I don't know if this is confirmed or anything. It's probably a bit of rumour here. Is it safe to assume that no new projects will be tendered on the conventional side until the unbundling process has kicked in? So what's your feeling about, in terms of tendering?
I mean, talking about delay the privatisation process, it's already been delayed. It was originally supposed to start in 2014, be complete by 2016, so that was missed. And then they set the deadline for the first GenCo to be unbundled, which will be about 15 to 20 gigawatts. Is the plan, is the fourth quarter of this year. And we're already in September, so that looks likely to be
do you
delayed
think that,
until next year.
Given that this unbundling into 4 GenCos, generation companies, is the plan, it's actually difficult for SEC to sort of procure or start new projects because the client is actually going to be a different legal entity?
Well, I think it depends on the immediate demand as well, or the demand in the next few years. I mean, they're moving ahead with renewables projects, and as I mentioned, they're catering for the fact that SEC is going to be privatised, 100% ownership in the IPP, and the principal buyer will be in the contract as the off-taker. So I don't think that would affect it if they needed the plant. As far as I understand, there's been delays because they're switching back to the IPP model. So prime example is the Taiba integrated solar and combined cycle project. Massive plant capacity of about 3,780 megawatts. That was tendered as an EPC/OEM model. They received bids last year under the OEM model in November, a few big companies. And I was in Saudi this week, and apparently that's going to be an IPP. So that's not been officially announced, but that looks likely to happen. I mean, that's been discussed for a while. So that's one reason for the delays. The other one
is that an SEC project?
It's an SEC project. The other big one was PP15, which was launched as an IPP. That expression of interest late last year.
If something is launched as an IPP, does that mean it's taken outside of the restructuring and privatisation of SEC? It becomes a sort of a separate special purpose vehicle project, a special private company, and it's not part of the GenCo or the SEC.
What happens with an IPP is a project development company set up to run the power plant for 25 years. Sometimes it transfers back. And previously, the government has had a stake in those. But moving forward, it could be the case that the developer has 100% ownership, and that would make more sense due to the fact they're going to sell off a lot of assets. The privatisation, I mean, there's a lot of capacity in the kingdom is fully government owned. It was tendered and built under EPC contracts operated by SEC.
So I'm not sure if I've followed. The questioner is saying, do we think projects will be delayed? I guess SEC projects will be delayed by the unbundling. What you're saying is yes, you think they will be?
I don't think just due to the unbundling, no. I think if there was demand for power, they'd have ordered it.
Okay.
I think the delay has been due to the fact they're switching towards IPP, so they're switching models.
Okay.
And they're also deciding which projects are necessary, so rationalising
it's a finance question as much as a...
I'm sure SEC, in terms of its planning, the unbundling might cause some extra work, but I think if there was demand there, they'd build them, they'd award the contract.
If the unbundling goes ahead at all.
Yes.
Yes, well, why do you say that? Because just because there are so many things they're trying to achieve.
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia is not alone in trying to have unbundled TND before. Oman has tried as well. And I think if it was that straightforward, it would have been done by now. I think there are inherent obstacles and challenges.
But they have made such a big statement of this is the plan, and whether it's part of the National Transformation Programme or just looking at utilities on their own, it has been such a big statement. It's kind of
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we could.
Well,
see
it's like PPP. That's the government's intention, but it's not the government alone who needs to implement it. It needs the private sector, and unless the private sector can be convinced on in these areas, then.
Well, as Jenny said, there's the having the environment that's attractive to commercial investors. I think also we know from experience that if oil prices suddenly recover to $100 a barrel, then suddenly it's back to square one because the dynamic has changed. But the view is that oil is in a structural position to stay longer for lower.
Yes.
No, lower for longer.
Lower for longer, yeah.
Okay, Jenny, so thank you for your patience whilst those two have hogged all the talking time. I have a question for you here. So this is coming from a company in Saudi Arabia. In terms of new public projects, so let's focus on infrastructure and transport because that's the area that you look at. Which sector within the construction and infrastructure market will have the most projects? Will it be on the transport side or on the general construction side? So I guess you can only talk about the transport side. But in the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, where are the projects going to come from? Is it these airports or is it roads?
Well, with the tendering of the 12 domestic airports for upgrade, I think they might slow down in terms of awarding capital infrastructure projects as far as airports are concerned. For railway, whether it's the metros, the urban railway projects in Mecca or in Jeddah, or whether the planned land bridge project, that's it's hard to say because as you have had the conversation earlier in a previous webinar with some of the PPP experts, you're looking at 12 to 18 months at least of negotiations. So, it's hard to say whether the Mecca Metro will be released to the market as a PPP or will they award it to the selected bidders this year. It's hard
this
to say.
week or in the past couple of weeks, you have written about the call for advisors, technical and financial advisors for the 4 metros in Jeddah, Mecca, Medina and Dammam. And so that means we're just at the start of the process if it's going to be done at PPP. But you've also written about the enabling works construction contract on Mecca Metro.
That's the preparatory work. So that's part. It's just the shell of the Mecca Metro trucks. It's not part of the $8 billion 3 contracts or 4 contracts that were due to be awarded in 2015. These preparatory works part of the contract that was awarded to Nesma and Partners in 2015. So technically, it's not part of the core infrastructure.
So whether it's PPP or conventionally procured or doesn't go ahead, this is an enabling works contract.
Yeah, so it's very uncertain. We don't know whether any of these projects will be released to the market over the next 12 months.
Okay, so we have on the Metro, we've got the 4 schemes which have just started the sort of expressions of interest for technical advisors. So those are at least 2 years away before anything more solid in terms of the model goes ahead, I guess. So the Metros are a long way off is what we're saying.
Yes.
And then what about on the mainline railways? So we have, you mentioned
for the Mecca Metro, there might be a slight possibility that they would go with EPC plus financing. But if we were to base it from the most recent development, where they were seeking for advisors for all 4 schemes, then it looks like yes, it will take more time than.
Do you think we've just seen you've been writing about Chinese investment in Egypt on a new railway linking Cairo with the new administrative capital. And the Chinese are coming in with, I can't remember the amount of money, but it's several $100 billion to finance that rail scheme. Is there a possibility, do you think, of Saudi Arabia allowing a government-backed foreign contractor to come in and build a metro, the Chinese, for example?
I think based on the MTP, on the guidelines and initiatives that have been approved for the transport sector, what I saw was they've only approved 5.5 billion reals over a period of 5 years. They've only allocated that for the privatization effort. So that's that's small. I mean, the Mecca Metro alone is so. What I'm trying to say is, I think all options are open. It all depends on what will be proposed by these technical and funding advisors that will advise the NCP. But I would say all options are probably on the table in terms of financing.
Okay, so in terms of transport then, it sounds like airports, that's where the immediate transport and infrastructure projects are going to come from. Railways, possibly, there's quite a lot of sort of analysis to be done before we'll see any significant railway projects.
But we have to remember that there are major projects due to be delivered. So Riyadh Metro is to be completed in 2019. And then the Haramain high-speed rail is expected to start operating next year. And the passenger component of the north-south railway is also expected to enter full operations late this year. So there's plenty that's going on in terms of the rail sector. But in terms of the pipeline of projects, there's very high level of uncertainty as to when they will come into the market.
And on the roads side, I don't know how much you've had a chance to look at the roads side of things, but do we anticipate any great highway projects? But maybe
I think there's a huge pipeline for road projects in Saudi Arabia. I don't think those schemes would be. I'm not sure how they might structure those schemes to become attractive to private investors. But usually, normally it's funded by the government. But there's a huge pipeline of projects for roads.
I get the impression from speaking to logistics companies that there's also maybe private finance rather than government spending going into logistic distribution hubs around the kingdom. So some private investment going into logistics.
Given given what they wanted to achieve, several economic cities, we have Jubail being expanded. I think there will be a requirement for them to build logistics centers, distribution centers. Again, that would be contingent upon how quickly all these projects come online. I mean, they're aiming for X amount of foreign direct investments, for instance. If all that happens, and I think that's where the logistics companies are coming from. If that happens, then there will be enormous market, so they will have to position themselves across the key logistics centers across Saudi Arabia.
Now, the questioner here, Ed, I'm going to come back to you. You've had your 5 minutes to catch your breath. So the question here is on the construction side, where will the best opportunities come, on the transport or in the building sector? And we do know that, particularly on housing, there are some big PPP plans at various locations with the Ministry of Housing, and we also have some big school and education projects and also some Ministry of Health projects. So all of those are straight construction. So we've heard Jenny talking about airports and railways. How does that compare with the opportunities or the pipeline for opportunities on the sort of the building side?
The fact is that opportunities in construction are way down on what they were 2 years ago.
Yeah.
In fact, even this year, construction is way down on the construction awards last year. It's a much more limited market right now, unfortunately. Where the opportunities do lie is in social housing, for the part of the housing programme, because the government recognises that there's an urgent requirement to build accommodation for
the Ministry of Housing has several kind of master plans where they're looking for private sector partners.
Yes. Yeah. Aramco has come up with the South Dhahran next phase of its township programme there. And there is some activity at the King Abdullah Economic City as well, where EMA has redesigned the Bela Sun area, and coastal towers are now under construction. But by and large, private sector activity and other real estate activity is very muted this year, and it will be for some time. Indeed, driving through Riyadh yesterday, you can see that there are a lot of half-finished towers. There's not a huge amount of activity on site. This is just anecdotal, but when you measure up and add up all the values of contracts awarded, you can see that it's a sector that's suffered a lot. And you're talking to construction contractors, and they all say the same thing.
I mean, really, the
very
public
difficult
sector
market right
is,
now.
the Ministry of Finance over the past 2 years has been so focused on bringing down the deficit, and at the end of 2016 the deficit was 17.5% or 17.2% of GDP. By the end of this year it's going to be about 9%. So a huge effort has been made on just to stop spending or to get on control. And it strikes me that that's still the dominant paradigm for all the ministries, the conventional ministry spending. So that's outside of Aramco and outside of the electricity sector. It's still on hold, isn't it?
Just stop. That's been the default position since the crisis came about.
That's
the
why
default,
PPP is so important, isn't it?
That's right. And the default position has been just to stop spending and to just sit and wait, which is not ideal because, of course, it has an impact down the line. It impacts contractors who suffer, and then the supply chain as well, and eventually people could be let go, and companies that could potentially go bust, and that has a big impact on the economy because you have less people with less money spending less.
Okay, I'm going to. We've got. Sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, there's a slight glimmer of the General Statistics Authority yesterday said the number of Hajj pilgrims this year increased by 26%.
Oh, really?
So
Did they give a reason for that?
Well, last year it contracted by 4%, right, because of the boycott primarily by the Iranians, I think. So I think that's somehow a positive sign that could fit into the other projects. So Mecca Metro being very important to the city and to the pilgrims travel as well. So that's probably a small positive sign that things could.
I mean, for 2 years now,
Yeah.
in terms of the strategic projects, the Mecca Metro has been outside of Aramco and things. The Mecca Metro has been up there, hasn't it? We've been waiting for it to be approved. So we've got a lot of questions, and we've only got 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask you all to answer these questions as quickly as you can, and I'm going to go through them in no particular order, just as they come. So this is for you, Jenny. When is Jeddah Metro likely to start, and will it be dependent on foreign investment? There's plenty of talk surrounding PPL. I don't know if I think that might be PPP. Is this a realistic option given the lack of transparency in the region? So Jeddah Metro, quick update.
Well, what we know is that they're looking for a technical advisor. So we're not really sure when it will. They reached pre-qualification in 2015, but we don't know exactly how they will proceed, whether it's EPC or PPP. But based on on the most recent development, it's going to be a PPP. Is it possible? I think I was just talking to the advisor to the company which is advising NCP yesterday, and he's saying it all depends on how these projects will be structured. Yeah. So it all depends on who will, exactly. Yeah. So it all depends on how the talks and discussions with consultants, investors, developers, operators over the next 12 months, really. So it's hard to predict
this is
which
really,
way it will
I think,
go.
why the National Transformation Programme is being reset, because it's great to announce PPP or all these things, but when you get into these issues about it's the risk allocation, it's the contract model, this is really complex detail, isn't it? It just takes time. And
then you have again, it goes back to regulations, right? It's not just PPP. For instance, they want regulations. They want the business permits to be released, to be able to be processed from 19 days to 1 day. But if you're trying to build, let's say, an aquaponics or hydroponics plant, is there any provision within the existing regulations as to what sector that's going to fall in? Where will it go? Which region will it go? And the other structures that's required to make that happen. So it's down to regulations, really.
Okay, so Andrew, moving on to you, we can see the cancellation for electrical substations, especially on the transmission sector. How do you see this changing if the government wants to continue on electrification plans? So basically the transmission and distribution sector, do you see any problems or bottlenecks there?
Well, I think part of that will be dependent on new generation projects. They'll need additional capacity. And then obviously the transmission and distribution network will need to be expanded and set up to configure correctly for renewables, which, see how that proceeds. And the other part of that is upgrading existing infrastructure. So the Kingdom, a lot of its generation and T&D infrastructure needs to be upgraded. It's
So
quite
the
old,
questioner refers to the cancellation of substations. What is that about? Do you know? I've not heard of particular. Ed, have you heard about cancellations? Okay, so basically generation comes first, then you've got to connect it all up.
There's that, and also upgrading existing infrastructure.
Okay.
So where it's necessary, it will go ahead.
So perhaps if you are the questioner who raised this topic, if you could give us some more details about what specifically it is that you're referring to, we can try and answer either in a later webinar or by email. Ed, if I can come back to you, prospects for the metals and minerals sector. So you mentioned the value chain and investment in aluminium and some of the heavier sectors. What do you think are the prospects?
Well, downstream industries and plastic production employs far more people on a per capita basis per $1 million of investment than oil and gas upstream or downstream does. So it makes a lot of sense for governments to trap or retain this resource value in Kingdom and create jobs and diversify the economy rather than simply exporting gas or oil or energy. So obviously with its access to oil and gas, Saudi Arabia has very low energy costs compared to other parts of the world, which makes in heavy industry very appealing. However, we haven't got as much gas as we did before.
Yeah.
Certainly almost no amounts of ethane, so that makes ethylene production very difficult and olefin production very difficult. But we do have a lot more NGLs and heavier feedstocks, which can be integrated with refineries to produce a range of plastic
We do have
products.
things though that Saudi Aramco is investing in the maritime city, this Ras Al Khair development as part of their in-kingdom total value project. So this is about creating local supply chain capacity. Do you think that's a significant? I mean, and that's Aramco,
Yeah,
but
because
obviously it applies across the
it's
whole.
about trying to retain as much value in the kingdom as possible from your output. As I said, again, you can produce steel, you can produce aluminium, you can produce petrochemicals. It's then a matter of what you do with them then. At the moment, a lot of it is just simply exported.
Yeah.
Can you maximise this potential by going even further downstream? Can you create a plastics park around? Can you produce white goods, automobile parts? Can you maximise your aluminium steel output and manufacturing locally rather than exporting to Japan or Korea and then seeing it coming back again in the form of a car, for example, or a TV or washing machine? So this is nothing new, of course. The kingdom has long been trying to do this. The trick now is there's not so much gas, and that makes things more problematic. The Madden approach, where you are having the whole supply chain from phosphate and bauxite all the way to the final product, is a solution, but it doesn't come cheap. But it is perhaps the way forward.
It strikes me that there are a number of parallel initiatives, well, more than a number, there is a huge number if you include MODON and the Industrial Clusters Programme and things like that, but you have, when Donald Trump was there in May or June, there was, $110 billion worth of defence contracts signed, and that all has a kind of offsets program with aerospace manufacturing components. So there's that stream around there. That we have the maritime city, Aramco, sort of maintenance and manufacturing yards. We have the Madden smelter also in Ras Al Khair, and across at King Abdullah Economic City, they're trying to attract in food manufacturers or whatever. So it does strike me that there is a very big focus on developing that capacity, and then with that, the logistics hubs, and so it feels to me like that is an area. But in terms of can we see any money going into projects, it's all.
Well, yeah, because this kind of thing would normally be private sector backed, project finance backed. So it's not necessarily dependent on government financing. But there also more needs to be done to stimulate regional economies to create a demand base for products. The reason really why the region lags behind in the production and manufacturing sectors is because the end user market is elsewhere. And ultimately, Saudi Arabia has 30 million people, but China has 1.3 billion. So it makes a lot of sense in most cases to manufacture closer to that end user market.
I mean, that's interesting. The renewables market So Saudi's got this big renewables program, and they're targeting for the first projects 30% local content, and they're looking for more of that in the future. They're hoping to manufacture parts, and a key part of that they want to export to the rest of the region. So that'll be dependent on a pickup of renewables across the region. And as Ed says, once you get sort of a supply chain requirement across the region, then that will help with regional manufacturing as well.
The problem is, everyone else is trying to do the same thing.
Well, exactly. Okay, thank you to all three of you. I'm afraid that's time up, so thank you for your time. I think we're going to have to come back to all of these questions many times. Thank you also for all of you, the viewers, for joining us today. I have too many questions to go through in the time available, so I apologise if we haven't answered your questions live. We will reply by email. We have contact details, so hopefully we can address your point. I think the summary picture is that Saudi Arabia is going through this huge process of shifting from being a government-driven economy into one that's focused on productivity and growth. We know that the Kingdom needs oil prices to be $84 a barrel just to break even, and oil is at 50. So huge deficits being run in Saudi Arabia. They need to find new financing models, and that is why PPP and privatization is on the agenda. But it is also, from what Jenny and Andrew and Ed have said, it's left us in this hiatus period where everything has to be changed, and it's just going to take time. But as Ed has just been saying there, and Andrew as well, the demand long term is there for growing population demand for manufactured products, for moving up the value chain, for electricity supply, and for transport and logistics. So the biggest economy in the region, the needs are there. It has plenty of reserves that it's trying to use efficiently, oil and financial reserves. So it is an important market. We will be coming back to this again and again, and we will try and get to these questions by email. So thank you for joining us today. I hope that was interesting and enjoyable for you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.